Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into something absolutely fascinating. We're unpacking the dense, early 20th century mystical diaries of Luisa Piccarreta. Now, whether you're a theology buff or just kind of fascinated by historical mysticism, these texts are wild. They propose a really intricate framework for how the human soul interacts with the divine. So our goal today is to take this deeply esoteric theology, decode it directly from the source material, and make it totally approachable for you.
Okay, let's dive into this. To make sense of thousands of pages of diary entries, we've organized this abstract theology into a clear 5-step roadmap. God's risky game, living in the divine will, the role of the victim, justice and earthly scourges, and finally, the ultimate mystical union.
Let's start right at the beginning with part 1, the origin of the whole theological problem, God's risky game.
So to really understand this theology, we first have to ask a fundamental question. Why on earth did God give humanity free will in the first place? Well, according to a diary entry from March 1926, all of physical creation, the stars, the sun, the earth, it all gives God what the author calls mute glory, because it literally has no freedom to change. But with humanity, God wanted more. He gave us reason, memory, and will. The text actually describes this as God placing his own will within the human will, almost like placing a wager on a counter. It was a literal divine gamble, intended to let humanity multiply this divine gift and become like little gods. And that right there sets up the central conflict of the entire diary, the massive tension between human autonomy and divine intention.
Now, the source text views this risky game in 3 major historical phases. First up, there was Adam. According to the text, the creature rejected the divine goods, and so, for the time being, the risky game completely failed. But because it was a divine game, God kind of had to make up for it. So we move to the second phase, the Immaculate Mama, or the Virgin Mary. In her, the text says the game didn't fail at all. It was a total success, because she surrendered her will entirely. Which brings us to the author's present day, the third phase. The diaries claim God is playing this risky game again with the author, and by extension, all of humanity. It's framed as a return match. The catch? Humanity has to wager the little flame of its own will to win back those divine goods.
And that brings us to the proposed solution. Let's look at part 2, living in the divine will.
The absolute crucial concept here is something frequently called the fiat, or the divine volition. The diaries are super specific about this. It is not just about avoiding sin or feeling sorry for your mistakes. In fact, a June 1907 entry explicitly states that while sorrow for sins is a good thing, it doesn't actually destroy one's own being. The fiat requires completely abandoning yourself, literally to the point where you forget your own being even exists. By effectively destroying the human ego, the soul supposedly reacquires the divine being. And the text claims that when you operate in this state, your acts are no longer subject to interruption. They become continuous, eternal acts, actively partaking in the divine operating itself.
Now, what's really interesting here is the stark visual metaphor the author uses to drive this home. In a July 1907 entry, the human will is described as a little drop of darkness, all full of disgusts and just inherently unhappy. The idea is that if it were to enter the divine will as it is, it would wage a literal war against God's happiness. By contrast, the divine will is described as a light that contained all possible tastes and forms divine beatitude. So the process of the fiat is essentially allowing this massive, vast light to completely dissolve that little drop of darkness. It turns the soul's coldness into heat and replaces all its miseries with divine happiness.
Of course, achieving a state like that requires a pretty agonizing method. That takes us to section 3, the role of the victim.
Here, the text introduces the really intense concept of the victim soul. The author frequently describes herself as being specifically chosen for this role. But what does that actually entail? Well, it means enduring extreme physical and spiritual suffering, and even more agonizing than the physical pain, according to the diaries, is the privation, the perceived total absence of God. Why on earth would someone undergo this? The theology claims that a victim soul acts like a giant sponge for divine justice. By suffering, the soul encloses the acts, reparations, and even the heartbeats of all humanity. It's effectively making up for the sins of all creatures and preventing God's justice from just destroying the world. It's an incredibly heavy, substitutionary role.
Because this role is so demanding, the text advocates for total, fearless resolution. There's a really great comparison drawn from a February 1908 entry. It contrasts a timid soul with a courageous soul.
A timid soul is described as having its legs tied. It only draws strength from itself, keeps its eyes low, and ultimately harvests almost nothing. It's completely hampered by the fear of these massive spiritual trials. A courageous soul, on the other hand, relies entirely on God. And the text makes a bold claim here. A courageous soul actually does more in one single day than a timid one does in an entire year. Absolute resolution is literally the only way to survive the trials of the victim.
So how do you actually achieve this? A December 25, 1908 entry prescribes 3 exact steps to make Jesus be born and grow in one's heart. First, you have to empty yourself of everything. The text uses the metaphor of moving into a new house. You can only bring your belongings in if the space is already empty. Second, you must do everything internally and externally for Jesus alone. The text claims that if even one single thought is for yourself, you are making the divine a slave. And third, you must have a heroic, magnified love of sacrifice. These 3 steps are the strict formula the diaries present for attaining this extreme mystical state.
Now, this deeply interior mystical state supposedly impacts massive, real-world events. Let's shift gears to Section 4, Justice and Earthly Scourges.
The diaries are absolutely filled with terrifying visions of real-world scourges. The author repeatedly writes that God's justice actually demands these events because of humanity's sins, but that the suffering of the victim's soul mitigates or delays them. The text specifically calls out terrifying real-world events, devastating earthquakes, and there are direct, chilling references to the catastrophic Messina earthquake of December 1908, right as it was happening. The diaries also list wars, foreign interventions, severe famine, lack of rain, violent social uprisings where the poor attack the rich, and vicious attacks on the church. The author impartially frames her own physical illnesses and spiritual darkness as the direct counterweight that keeps these global disasters from being even worse.
And this brings us to an incredibly striking quote from August 1908 that perfectly captures the text's intense view of divine action during these global chastisements. The quote reads, "Love never says enough. Even if love scourged the soul and tore her to pieces, it pulverizes those pieces. It reduces them to nothing, and into that nothing it blows its fire." I mean, wow! This brilliantly illustrates the theology's perspective. Global scourges and personal sufferings aren't just seen as mere punishments. They are viewed as a harsh, refining fire. The ultimate goal of this divine fire is to completely melt down the human shape and rebuild it entirely into something divine.
Which leads us directly to the end goal of all this abandonment and suffering. Section 5, the ultimate mystical union.
Let's see how all this builds into the soul's final objective, absolute union with the divine. The text is full of these incredibly intimate dialogues between the author and Jesus, using simple but profound metaphors to describe the divine nature the soul is trying to join. In a September 1908 entry, Jesus is quoted as saying simply, "I am light because I am truth." The idea is that for the soul to have light in its actions, those actions must come entirely from truth. Any artifice or duplicity just creates darkness. So the ultimate union requires the soul to become completely transparent, matching the uncreated light and truth of the divine will.
We're going to conclude with this fascinating and honestly provocative view on human questioning from a January 1909 entry. The author asks why certain illnesses and scourges have to happen. The response is pretty shocking. It says, "The story of why is long. It is enough to tell you that there is no evil in the world which does not carry the mark of why. Why is destruction of divine wisdom in souls." Think about that for a second. According to this theology, the very act of questioning God's methods is born of egoism and is the literal root of humanity's fall. It leaves us pondering a profound mystical demand, absolute, unquestioning surrender over the human ego. It's a challenging, intense framework that leaves us asking ourselves, what does it truly mean to completely surrender our will? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the source material. I hope this explainer brought some clarity to a highly complex topic, and I will see you next time.